I think it also reflected, I think, generally the spirit in the room, and the fact that if the G20 had decided that a declaration was not possible because one member had voluntarily decided not to participate at all, I think that would have set a really bad precedent for the G20 going forward. The whole principle of consensus is about countries around the table, and the AU and the EU, countries around the table identifying how they can adopt the different priorities in the declaration in a way that speaks to their national interests and also recognizes the bigger global context. If you're not in the room, can you veto it? Okay. Was that the intention of the consensus principle? And I would argue no, and I would argue that if it is, because certainly some people would see it that way, you then open the door next year, if somebody doesn't like the US presidency, to say, well, we're not going to engage at all. In the US presidency, obviously the US did participate in some of the discussions, particularly in the finance track, so it's not that they opted out completely, but obviously after the Truth Social tweet, or whatever it's called, by President Trump a few weeks ago, they no longer participated in the discussions around the declaration. So I think, in the circumstances, I think everybody agrees that one country shouldn't be able to stop multilateral global processes which are trying to deal with some global challenges where we require international cooperation.
And that is, as you say, the underlying statement about what G20 should be. Multilateral global processes. Ursula von der Leyen saying yesterday that uncertainty is growing, imbalances widening, and dependence are weaponized. But she says, most importantly, so we need cooperation over confrontation, diversification over disruption. And we've seen a lot of European leaders, and we're not talking small country, but powerful European leaders who are here, and powerful leaders of international multilateral institutions. And I don't think it's just about supporting South Africa. It's because they're here to talk grown folk business, if I have to put it like that, Liz. Because I was at the Health Working Group Summit in Limpopo. It didn't come out with a declaration. And one would have thought that health is the one unifying factor. But it's about the language that countries are just disagreeing on, and the commitments that the overall ideological objectives, no, fine, we agree with it, but here's what we want in that statement. And I want to talk about that for those who are going to try and pretend that it's a vanity project, it's a pity moment for South Africa, about how real and legitimate these discussions have been.
I think you make a very important point. So we have a declaration which has been, negotiated over many, many, many long hours. And I think kudos to our diplomats, but also kudos to everybody else who participated from the other delegations over the course of last week. But the reality, of course, is that the world is moving away, and this is not just about Donald Trump. This has been a trend that simply Donald Trump is perhaps the most acute manifestation of. Moving away from certain principles that we had all accepted even 10 years ago around just the Paris Agreement on climate change, or the Sustainable Development Goals, or the commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment. There is greater division around these issues, and also I think what has happened over the last, not just this year, but even going back to the first Trump presidency, the creation of an enabling environment to be able to say certain things. And so there are real differences. And in the course of the year, we know that there were a number of working groups that were unable to come out with a a ministerial declaration. The chair's summary often is not a bad thing. It does reflect both the discussions, but also where there were some areas of consensus, but that they couldn't ultimately take it across the finish line. And sometimes it is really also about, adept negotiators in doing that. But the reality is that we're entering a moment where consensus, not in the narrow G20 sense, but where consensus around certain norms and principles is fast eroding, unfortunately. And part of that is because I think the case hasn't been made sufficiently well to ordinary people, the point that you were also making earlier, about why international cooperation, multilateral processes are actually important and that they have an impact on their lives. And relatedly, the fact that democratic societies have also seen heightening inequality, which of course was another priority of the South African presidency. We saw the inequality panel. And that the cost of living, people feel that they have been left behind, and they begin to see salvation and solutions in big men. They usually are big men, not women, with ostensibly very easy answers to actually highly complex problems. And that means a turning away from these global frameworks. So why should we sign on to the Paris Agreement and continue to respect it? Why should we think that the Sustainable Development Goals are important, etc., etc.? We'll do our own thing. But we know that global challenges like pandemics in the context of the Health Working Group, like climate change, how do you deal with disasters, actually have an impact on all of us. Inequality in one country actually also impacts other countries. There are domino effects there. And there is a responsibility, I think, on us, sort of, the chattering classes and governments and elites to actually be able to deliver more effectively and to make the connections better.
And Liz, I'm actually also thinking being emboldened by the language where there is consensus. Because when we talk about a new EU-South Africa minerals partnership, where it promises mutual benefit. I mean, that is a bold statement, if anything, because we know that the global north has been more about extractive practices, and now Africa is talking about beneficiation. It underscores that as what's going to guide it. How do we ensure that the private sector in those countries actually is held to that promise?
So I think that's an important point, because we can have governments make declarations and make announcements, but at the end of the day, a lot of the economic dimensions of, for example, what's in the critical minerals framework, also in the G20, not only in the bilateral discussion with South Africa earlier and with Africa. These need to be delivered by the private sector in most cases, and of course, it's a two-way thing. And it really, in that instance, depends on the one hand on the kind of environment that you have in country, the kind of policies you have in country, to be able to create opportunities for the private sector to actually create the value chains in partnership maybe with local or with regional players in the economic terrain. Of course, in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, one of the things that is important is not to create national value chains, but to actually ensure that you spread the goodies in terms of value benefit of beneficiation. So there is a dimension that and a responsibility on African governments on the one hand, to ensure that if investors are coming into their country to mine a particular resource, and it's not just about the so-called green minerals, it can also be other minerals, that there is the opportunity to be able, and it's not sort of prohibitively expensive, to be able to link up with local players, or to bring in other investors who can sort of be part of the value chain. And then on the, because private sector will go where there is money. That's not going to change. It has to be profit driven. I mean,
and there must be clarity, whether it's of policy, certainty in terms of the project itself, and scalability, profitability.
So they need to be bankable, and the regulatory environment needs to be predictable. And we know that these are challenges that African countries, while very context specific, and some are better than others, have to actually face head on. You're not going to bring in the private sector unless there is an environment that actually makes it easy for them to do business. What is that? Well, there's energy. It could be infrastructure, roads, connectivity. It may also be security. So these are all components that African states have to be mindful of. And on the other side, of course, there is potentially also the creation on sort of, say, the European side of an engagement with the private sector, of their own private sectors, about how they work together to advance these. So it's not a simple, we have an agreement so now this will happen.
Boom, And I want to talk about inequality, because I want to look at that report in just a moment. But when we talk about multilateralism being under strain, so with these geopolitical fractures widening, as we're seeing, the fact that China's not here, the fact that Russia's not here, and South Africa finding itself, particularly with that moniker label of non-alignment, post the G20, it must still find its way, and with BRICS, for instance, it must still find its way to nail its colors to the mast, because I don't think that it can choose to be transient depending on who it speaks to in implementing those G20 principles that will be part of the troika of that U.S. leadership. So the question is the major powers being absent, the G20 as a platform for global problem solving. Can we now say it has become a collective of parallel national agendas under one roof?
So, of course, China, the president isn't here,
yes.
Xi Jinping, but of course the premier is.
But it would be an important symbolic moment.
Yeah. And of course, in the case of President Putin, he can't come.
Well, but that is also interesting, because I remember we did that with Sudan's president, al-Bashir. Yeah. And we fought for the fact that he could be here and we weren't arrest him.
Yeah. But I think that was a different time in South Africa's foreign policy. So I think that has been, you can see that in the declaration, the issue of the, not maybe triumph, maybe is too strong and perhaps a negative word in this context, but the importance of national context, national interest, national circumstances. I haven't done a Google's a sort of a search on the PDF for how many times national circumstances or national context is mentioned, but I suspect you'll find it quite a few times. I mean, I sat in some of the discussions, and this came up regularly. So there is, and this is partly a response to what we were talking about earlier, which is rising domestic dissatisfaction with particular policies, and sometimes policies that they believe have been imposed externally. So, for example, issues around climate change and the need to decarbonize, and the cost that may be associated with that, and the impact on particular communities that may be the most affected by decarbonization. So it might be coal communities. So when you come together and try to make a series of commitments, albeit these commitments are not smart, they're not specific, measurable, time-bound, etc. Countries tend to be very, very reticent, even if the commitments are unspecific, to agreeing to something that might be problematic in their own context, or which they see may constrain them in their domestic policy environment. Now, South Africa for a long time, also in the context of some of the rules around the WTO, has always said it's important to maintain policy space, to create policy space. Don't constrain us in what we can and can't do. Now, the G20 is not the WTO, but I think that concern, that reticent sense of saying, well, no, we're not going to talk about the eradication of fossil fuels. Okay, because that would be inimical to our interests as an oil producer or a coal producer or whatever.
And our development as an economy.
And our development as an economy.
That's just the reality.
Yeah. So I thought the way in which you described it is an interesting way. As a committed multilateralist, I wouldn't want to be so cynical, but saying it's an umbrella under which a whole host of national interests actually come together, I think is an interesting way of actually seeing it. And I think, notwithstanding the declaration, notwithstanding the desire, I think, by everybody to show that multilateralism can work, that international cooperation is important, I think you are seeing, even in the declaration, those sort of pressure points and tensions that we see on a daily basis in various countries.
Because ultimately, we are looking for signs or confirmation of hegemony. And what does, because if we talk about consensus, to me, that's what it would suggest, right? But I know that it's a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complex than that. It can't just be a single word characterization, and especially as we're talking about the non-binding nature of the G20. But it is the G20. We're going into the G7 after that. We are looking at whether or not there is going to be continuity of that spirit.
Yeah. And next year, I think, will be interesting. I think the agenda is going to be much narrower. There are certain things that are going to completely fall by the wayside. And it will be interesting to see how the US manages the principle of consensus. And I think, there are challenges even in the G7. So in terms of coherence and national interests, I mean, we saw the Canadian G7 summit also sort of because of the disruption end up with a number of a few sort of statements on specific issues, and then a chair's summary. I think it is reflective of the growing contestation, power contestation, the fact that more countries are now in a position to assert and have the power to assert influence and assert that they are not going to necessarily sort of fall into line. And it is, it's domestic pressures that we shouldn't underestimate, and concerns about, so if you talk about inequality, the very real challenges that countries with high inequality face, and how do you address that speedily without having constraints that are brought on by international agreements, or even if they're voluntary. I mean, if you look at the declaration, you can also do a search for voluntary. There is a whole host of voluntary principles, voluntary commitments, etc., from energy to development to digital, whatever, to energy security, and non-binding, voluntary and non-binding. So these are a nice set of principles, but we really don't.
And also depending on the administration,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And I'm glad you went into that, because we're going to take a quick break, Liz. I want us to look into that G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality, because this is the first time this has happened, and what does it mean in terms of continuity from some of the themes that the Latin American countries have brought into G20 leadership. We're going to take a quick break. You are listening to Channel Africa, live broadcast from here, G20 Leaders Summit, second day, final day here at Nasrec.
This weekend, South Africa will host the G20 summit at the Nasrec. And real-time insights from the main venue. And so, our regular lineup will be adjusted just a little bit for this weekend to accommodate the G20. On Saturday, the 22nd of November, the Oasis will broadcast for 2 hours. Out and About takes a break for a full look at the G20. After Africa Chart Toppers, our news and current affairs team will bring you special live broadcasts in 5 different languages directly from Nasrec. And normal programming will resume at 8 p.m. Central African Time. And then on Sunday, the 23rd of November, the Oasis will also broadcast for 2 hours. Tech Africa steps aside for our news and current affairs teams to bring you special live broadcasts in 5 different languages. Then, Planting the Seed resumes from 1 p.m. till 2 p.m. Central African Time. Channel Africa, your window to the continent, connecting you to the world in an African perspective. The world is watching Johannesburg. Leaders from the planet's biggest economies gather to make decisions that shape nations, markets, and futures. You already know, Channel Africa will be right there, bringing you the conversations, insights, and analysis that matter.
The best is yet to come.
The G20 Summit from the 22nd to the 23rd of November. As it happens, from an African perspective. Stay tuned to Channel Africa and get all the G20 analysis.
Darubini ya Afrika na I am Henry Shakif.
Deogratus Bwire, wewe kama mkurugenzi wa shirika la kutetea haki za binadamu kutoka kule Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Maandamano yameendelea kwa siku ya pili. Nini kinaendelea?
Kwanza mimi ningependa tusiliweke kama wafuasi wa upinzani. Kwa sababu kiukweli mimi nilipata kidogo kushuhudia watu waliokuwa wanapita barabarani hawakuwa kwa namna yoyote ile wamebeba bendera ya chama chochote cha upinzani.
Umezungumzia swala zima vitu ambavyo havijakaa sawa vinapaswa kurekebishwa. Vitu hivyo ni nini?
Hivyo vitu ambavyo havijakaa sawa tayari nimeshavisema. Unajua kumekuwepo na mtiririko wa matukio mengi sana. Watu ambao wanakuwa wanapinga masuala kadha wa kadha ambayo yanaonekana kufanywa na vyombo vya dola kwenye mitandao.